Again, I want to welcome everybody. And again, it's about 5 minutes after 10. Thank you for your patience. And again, I will just remind you that because this is a part 1 and a part 2, that we will conclude our conversation today at noon, and then we will meet later in the week. So I want to welcome you all to Cultural Competence, a journey to improved outcomes. My name is Paul Warren. But before we take care of those logistical details, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. And I will also just remind people, if you're able to activate your cameras, please do so, because participation is part of what this course is about, and it will be easier for you to participate if you have your camera activated. So my name is Paul Warren. As I said, I'm a social worker, and I'm currently a research project director at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and I'm also a senior staff trainer and curriculum writer for the Northeast and Caribbean Addiction Technology Transfer Center. And very pleased to have the opportunity to be here with all of you to engage in a learning community conversation about cultural competence. So before, why don't we go ahead and take care of some of the logistical things, and then I want to ask you a question specifically about the title of this particular course, okay, which again is Cultural Competence, a journey to improved outcomes. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and as you can see, this is part 1 of our conversation, and we have about 37 people participating in this conversation, 38 including myself. And I will say, in regard to that, I really feel fortunate every time I have the opportunity to facilitate this particular conversation / training, because I feel like it's a continued opportunity for me to be thinking about these issues and thinking about where I sort of fit in terms of my own cultural identity and sort of my historical cultural identity. And again, as we move forward, we'll talk more about that. So as a reminder, kind of our overarching guideline is that we do acknowledge that words have power, that how we say things, what we say actually matters. We want to be putting people first, and we want to be using language that's respectful, inclusive, and inspires hope and advances recovery. Our funder likes us to acknowledge that what we talk about in this learning community, in our sort of cultural competence Vegas, is what we're talking about. And it's based on our experiences and our thoughts and our beliefs. So keeping that in mind, they do like us to acknowledge that what we talk about, what I talk about, the content that I might be sharing may not necessarily represent their official views. And it's also, I think, important for folks to know that what I've put together in parts 1 and 2 is really drawn from an 18-hour course. So I've taken an 18-hour course and I've kind of condensed it and arranged it in such a way that we're going to spend 4 hours covering it, 2 today and 2 when we meet later in the week. And New York State OASIS, this was a curriculum that they worked with another organization called CCSI to develop, the 18-hour curriculum. This is our agenda for part 1. We're currently in Introduction to the Training. We will talk about why cultural competence, and we will talk about the social determinants of health, person-centeredness and cultural competence, and implicit bias. And that will be more than enough for us to talk about today. And depending on where we get, we may even cover some of this when we meet next. So a couple of additional disclaimers specifically in regard to this training. One of them is when you conclude this training, I'm sorry to tell you, and if you're disappointed, I'm sorry, but you will not be getting a certificate that says stamp, you are culturally competent after this training. Also, what we talk about in this conversation may and often does bring up unfinished business. People want to look at history. They want to learn and sort of do a little bit of research and find out more. So I can assure you that probably by the conclusion of part 2, or even today, there will be unfinished business for each of us that we will continue our learning and research process. The other piece too, I think to consider, and this is sort of with some of our other guidelines, is that when you're talking about your experience or when I'm talking about mine, those are our personal truths. And they are what they are. We've had the experiences we've had. We can talk about those things together in a way that is respectful and keeps our learning community safe. And again, we just want to acknowledge that although we may not have the same experience as somebody else, that is their truth, and we want to offer respect in regard to that. So to further carry that out, we have these basic guidelines, which again, we want to give each other the respect of listening to each other and acknowledging our differences. We're all different, and that's a positive and a good thing in our learning community conversation. We don't have to agree either. Somebody shares a particular point that you don't agree with or that I don't agree with, that's their point, and that's perfectly okay. The goal is not for us to agree. The goal for us is to listen to each other and engage in a conversation that feels safe and inviting for everybody. Again, speak from the self, making I statements. Again, as we said, what happens here stays here. Our confidentiality, we want to make sure that we're protecting each other's confidentiality. And then again, please use this as an opportunity to discuss these things, share in a way that's honest and to the degree that you feel comfortable. And again, sharing whatever it is in a positive fashion that really invites dialogue. Again, expect unfinished business. And if somebody feels uncomfortable with something that's said, and I'll tell you, I've had the opportunity to facilitate this conversation a number of times now, and it's probably impossible for somebody not to feel uncomfortable at one moment or another during the conversation. And if you'd like to say ouch, and we can pause and sort of kind of take apart what the discomfort is, we can do that. And my hope also is that we'll have fun, that this can be also a fun opportunity for all of us. So to keep it a safe space, we want to make sure that there is no racism, no sexism, no ableism, no ageism, no sizeism, no xenophobia, no homophobia, no transphobia, no fat phobia, and no hate. So before we talk a little bit about this iceberg, but before we even talk about the iceberg, we're going to talk a little bit about the title of the course. I just want to stop sharing my screen and just ask if everybody who's participating can agree to those guidelines. And if you can agree to those guidelines, wave, nod, give me a thumbs up, throw money, whatever works for you. Oh, good. And Victoria's using, wonderful. Thank you, Robert. Thank you. Good. And folks are using their electronic thumbs up too, which is fantastic. That's great. And again, I will just say, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but we have now, which is fantastic, we have over, I would say over 40 people now participating in this conversation. I think about 43, 44, including myself. And again, if you can activate your camera, please go ahead and do that. Yeah, Bernice, I see that you have your hand up. Is that to agree to the guidelines, or did you want to ask a question? Great. So Bernice, if you want to ask a question, feel free to unmute. Okay. So, okay, wonderful. Okay. All right, so I'm going to lower Bernice's hand. But again, Bernice, if you do want to ask a question, just unmute and you can do that. Oh, great. And I think Bernice just let me know she was agreeing to the guidelines. Thanks, Bernice. That's great. So folks, what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat the name of the course again, which is Cultural Competence, a Journey to Improved Outcomes. And I'm curious, and I'm wondering if I could ask Asia. Asia, would it be okay if I asked you this particular question? And you can let me know that yes or no. Okay, great. So Asia's okay with that. Given that this course is called Cultural Competence, a Journey to Improved Outcomes, from your perspective, and I'm going to invite a number of other people to comment on this as well, what does cultural competence have to do with improved outcomes? Juanita, what is your thought about how cultural competence is related to improved outcomes?
Well, to me, culture is, I guess when I think of it, I think of differences.
Okay.
And I think of, I guess, yeah, that's the biggest word for me is differences, right? So when I think of culture, I think of a variation of backgrounds, right? A variation of people, a variation of, and competence. Like to me, those two kind of don't go together, competency and culture. For some reason, my brain isn't putting those two together.
Yeah.
Because when I think of competency, I think of, ability or, are you able to? I guess
Yeah.
for I'm just having a hard time putting those two together, culture, competency. But
Thank you.
culture, I get as differences when I think of different backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, different views, different point of views, different different scenarios culturally.
Perfect. That's fine. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's excellent. So I'm going to read what Asia wrote in the chat, it means everything due to having a well-rounded approach to dealing with several different people who come from several different backgrounds and cultures. So the idea of having cultural competence is being able to be effective, and Asia, tell me if I'm getting this right, is the ability to be effective in working with people sort of that may not be of the same cultural experience as you as an individual. Rashana, did you have a thought about that?
I guess it would be the same thing that Mrs. Kilpatrick said, basically dealing with people that have different cultural views, even as far as like religious beliefs, has to be taken into account. Sure. And I guess just understanding and navigating different personalities.
Okay. Rashana, could I ask you a follow-up question? So I agree with everything that you said and everything that everybody has said so far. And I'm curious, so how does that connect to better and improved outcomes?
I would say if you understand someone's cultural background, it would be better in the workplace because you won't maybe offend them culturally or religiously or say something that might offend their religion or might offend their culture. So I guess just a knowledge of someone's background, or even if you don't understand it, just ask questions and make sure you're letting the person know, I'm just trying to gain clarity so that I don't do anything to offend you. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And Asia added to what she typed. She also said it makes you relatable. Julianne, what do you think? What's your thought about the relationship between sort of cultural competence and improved outcomes?
So I don't know what other people's work backgrounds are here in this group, but my work background is very relationship based, and so if you are wanting to build a good relationship with somebody, it's essential to have a baseline understanding and respect of their culture and an openness to learn more and to make sure that, like Rashana was saying, to not offend and to learn more.
Super. Thank you. And Robert, maybe we can hear, you can kind of have the final word on what your thought is about this connection between cultural competence and improved outcomes.
It's basically echoing what everyone has said, is understanding each other, for whatever their backgrounds are, and becoming competent in receiving all of the different differences that basically everyone has.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Wendy wrote in the chat, and I like the practicality of what you wrote, Wendy, the idea of that it improves your ability to communicate. And Alberto wrote, less is lost in translation. Alberto, I don't know if you're able to unmute, but could you unmute and say a little more about that? If you can elaborate in the chat, that would be great. Oh, you don't have a mic. Okay. All right. Sorry to hear that. If you could say just a little more about that, the sort of lost in translation, or Rebecca, what do you think Alberto means by less is lost in translation? What do you think? Yeah.
If you're not aware of someone's culture,
Yeah.
and you're trying to communicate with them and you don't know how to effectively communicate, it's lost on them because you're not communicating effectively. You don't know the culture. You might say something that's offensive when you don't really intend to be offensive. So you really need to know the culture so that you can translate effectively. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thanks. All right. So anybody else at this particular moment? Let's see. Shimon says it encourages the acceptance of different approaches, behaviors, and cultural beliefs. It encourages the acceptance of different appearances, behaviors, and cultures and beliefs. Rashana, do you agree with that? I saw your head nodding. Yeah. Say a little more about that, why you agree with it.
I feel like when you understand something, you accept it a little bit better. And you're accept more of the behaviors or their beliefs that may be strange to you or may be strange to others. But I guess understanding their background is where you can accept the behaviors that you might think or deem as not socially normal.
Okay, so again, having some awareness about that culture, you can better understand why somebody may be doing what they're doing or saying what they're saying, because it might not be part of your cultural experience. People are writing things in the chat, which is great, and I want to just make sure that I read them all. Giovanna wrote, when you have an understanding of an individual's background or ethnicity, it allows you to understand the individual's perspective. Which will allow the clinician to better serve the client, which will produce a better outcome. And notice that chain, sort of that link of, people are really writing long things in the chat, which is fantastic. Natasha wrote, stress levels and outcomes have an inverse relationship. People become stressed due to feeling excluded, misunderstood. Stress leads to poor outcomes. Cultural sensitivity, awareness, competence helps reduce stress associated with exclusion, misunderstandings, etc., leads to better outcomes. And Eddie writes, being culturally competent helps eliminate bias and hegemonic ideas. But there was a little bit more that came in the chat, so a lot more actually. So let me just read that. Yes, Christina writes, it'll help you better understand the individual's point of view. It allows us to be aware that every culture is different and not judging one because we don't understand said culture. And it also allows us to be aware of our own biases, okay? Asia writes, learning new patterns of behavior and effectively applying them in appropriate settings. To Alberto's point, Julianne wrote this, to Alberto's point. Things getting lost in translation could be anything from language to tone or body language, which again are all part of culture. Body language, all these things can have a different meaning to different cultures. Knowing these things, hold on a second, knowing these things don't have to, one, set in stone meaning, and being open to learn alternative translations can help us build better communication or communicate better. Am I right? Did I get that right, Julianne? Essentially. Okay. All right. Erica writes, translation is very important. If not correct, that could hinder the proper assistance needed for the client. Okay. So communication, being able to provide the correct service to that particular client. Absolutely. So let me ask you this, folks. What do you think gets in the way of cultural competence? What do you think gets in the way? And let's have folks write that in the chat. What do you think gets in the way of cultural competence? And I probably won't be able to read all of them, but I'll read as many as I can. Okay, a closed mind, no awareness, preconceived notions, lack of understanding, misinformation, bias, prejudices, misinformation, biases, being afraid to ask questions. Thanks, Jasmine. Our own biases, not accepting differences, biases, assumptions of what a person's needs are, prejudice, cultural narcissism, yeah, or cultural centrism, where media, yes, Tatiana, because again, that carries a lot of the messaging to folks, to all of us on a daily basis. Misinformation, yeah. What we think we know, Mozilla, absolutely. So we may make assumptions about what we think we know about somebody. All right. So just one additional unwillingness to engage another person. Yeah, thank you, Shimon. So let me ask you this. Let's go back to the slides for just a minute, and then I'll follow up with another question. We can think of sort of cultural identity as, and I really appreciate this image because there are things that we can sort of see above the waterline, and those are the things that we see, that we think we may know, and all of that. And then there are many more things, the biggest part of the iceberg, which is part of someone's cultural identity. Those are the pieces that we can't see because they're below the waterline. And as service providers, we might need to know those things or know those things about that person because it may be necessary to meet their needs. It may be a way to understand them better and be able to engage them more effectively. Yeah. Shimon also wrote unwillingness to, okay, I read that, unwillingness to engage another person. Yes, thank you. So thinking of yourself in terms of this sort of model, the things that are above the waterline and the things that are below the waterline, that if we were in a room together, a physical room together, that I would be able to observe, I might be making assumptions, but those are the things I would see. Those are the things that I would observe, okay? And again, all the things we may not know. And some of those things we may never know. So let me ask you this, just thinking about that iceberg and thinking about above the waterline and below the waterline, okay? So looking at me, what can you tell about my cultural identity? What can you tell about my cultural identity? And again, we're in our learning community. This is a conversation, and I'm asking you to go with what you see above the waterline. Dolina said nothing. Okay. You're in the older generation. Okay, so you know a little bit about my age. You know that I'm male. Alberto writes American culture. Okay, anything else? Neat appearance. Okay, thank you. Anything else that you notice? I'd like to ask you what your cultural identity is. Okay, so Eric wants to ask a question, but Eric, I'm asking you to go above the waterline. Okay. Educated, Pamela says. Likes muted colors. Okay, thank you, Mozella. All right, thank you for adding to that. Anything else that you can tell? Take a good look. Oh, okay. Juanita says that I'm artistic. Okay. Works from home. Yes, that's true. I am working from home. So you can tell that. Okay. Anastasia said that I'm Caucasian. Yes, I like color as well, but I'm Caucasian. I'm white. Okay. Professional and confident. Okay. Tess. Okay. All right. So again, this idea of cisgender, Eric, say a little more about that, because not everybody may know what cisgender means.
You identify with the gender or the sex you were assigned at birth.
Yes, yes. And are you basing that on this moment, or are you basing that on a prior disclosure that I made that you know from a prior conversation?
I'm making that based on my own view of you.
Yes, above the waterline.
Yes.
Above the waterline.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. And Eric is correct. My gender identity matches my assigned sex at birth. And Janelle, very observant, says it is also written in your name. It's next to my name. Yeah, those are the pronouns that I use. Perfect. All right. And we would also acknowledge that this is what's above the waterline, but there's probably a lot more below the waterline that's part of my cultural identity. Yes? Okay. And you wouldn't necessarily know that by looking at me. Just like I wouldn't necessarily know that by looking at you. And it may be important to you for me to know that. Okay, so just, okay. Giovanna says, you are well-groomed, knowledgeable of the topic, and you know how to keep the audience meaningful. Okay. Meaningfully engaged. Okay, there was another piece of that. All right. Well, I hope that is the case, and that's what I'm striving for. So folks, what I'm going to ask you to do at this particular moment, and again, I'm going to ask you to type this in the chat. And I'm going to ask you to think about your own cultural identity. Okay? So you're thinking about your own cultural identity. And remember, culture is that it's big. Culture is a lot of things. But your own cultural identity. And I'm going to ask you, Alberto just wrote mixed culture. So I'm going to ask you to type in the chat something that's important to you about your cultural identity. And remember, this is what's important to you. There's no right or wrong here. It's just something that's important to you about your cultural identity. And if you could, just go ahead and type that in the chat. And if you also could, everybody please read the chat that I will, and I'm also going to put something in too, because it asking the question made me think of it. Yeah, men of color, yeah, okay. Being open-minded and understanding, African-American, Jewish. Yeah, so people are putting Caribbean culture, principal, West Indian, African-American, Trinidadian. Yeah, 100% Puerto Rican. I love lots of identity and take pride in being mixed Spanish, African, and Native cultures. Haitian, wonderful. So again, folks, as you look at these, an educated person of color, African-American, thanks, Michael, thanks, Tess. And again, keep in mind, folks, as you look at this, these are things that people have identified for themselves that are important about their cultural identity. It's important to me that instead of assuming I am Black or African-American, that I am asked what I identify as. Sort of back to Eric's, I want to ask you what your cultural identity is. Yeah. And again, I really appreciate that you don't want people to make assumptions about that. So thank you, Asia. Well, Asia, would you mind, could I ask you a follow-up question? Would that be okay? Okay, so can you just say a little bit about why it is you don't want somebody to make that assumption? Okay, Asia's typing, okay. And the reason I'm asking that is it's kind of along the lines of what Eric was saying, like, I want to understand from your perspective, because I don't want to assume why Asia doesn't want somebody to assume her race, that she wants to be asked. And I will tell you, in all honesty, I might see Asia on the street, or I might meet Asia in a training, and I might make an assumption. And if you think you would make an assumption, wave, nod, or throw money. Do you think you might make an assumption? Yeah, I would too. And that would not be understanding where Asia is coming from. So I do not like to be placed in a category that limits my identity. Okay. Okay. So you experience your cultural identity, your cultural identity to be bigger than just that. Am I getting that right, Asia? Yes. Okay. Yep. And Rashana likes that, Asia. She likes the fact that you're being seen as a larger identity, not just assumptions. Okay. I identify as Aboriginal, Indigenous, Native American of this land, not from Africa. Maybe some of my ancestors have come from other places, but I am from here. Thank you. Thanks so much, Asia. That's a very specific part of your identity. And I'm going to read that again because I want everybody to kind of hear that specifically. And Asia, thank you for sharing sort of part of your cultural identity that's under the waterline. I identify as Aboriginal, Indigenous, Native American of this land, not from Africa, or not from African. Maybe some of my ancestors have come from other places, but I am from here. Erica writes, it happens all the time. Socially, usually we just look at skin color and automatically put you in a category. It happens to my children all the time. They are mixed, but some think they are Hispanic. Erica, are you able to unmute? Erica? If you're able to unmute, I would be very interested to ask you to say a little bit more about that.
Okay, so for instance, like my husband's white and I'm Black. And anytime I go out with my children, like without my husband, they always think we're Hispanic. For some reason, they think we're Dominican. So they would even come up and just start speaking Spanish to me, and I'm not. And even the kids, when my kids are in school, my oldest one was taking Spanish, and automatically the teacher thought he was Hispanic. So it happens a lot, and then they have to explain, no, I'm this, I'm mixed, I'm half Black, half white. But it happens all the time.
Right. So this assumption gets made.
Yeah, automatically. They just look at the skin color. Yeah.
Yeah. So Erica, could I ask you just a brief follow-up question?
Sure.
Why do you think that is?
I really think it's bias. I think people look at you and they just automatically assume, just like Asia said, they see you as Black, they almost automatically think you're Black, you're African American, and that's not the case. So it's just a bias because their curly hair, their way their skin is, they automatically think they're Spanish. So this is a bias.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks so much. All right. So I see that a couple of other people wrote some things in the chat. Let me just take a look at those quickly. Okay. Dolina writes, I get that also. People always assume that I am of Latin descent. Tatiana wrote, I am a Costa Rican heterosexual female raised around Caribbean and African American culture. So I have adopted many things from diverse ethnicities, including food, music, and I belong to a D9 sorority. Okay. Dolina writes, I am a 60-year-old and I have gotten that. I'm 60 years old and I have gotten that all my life. And I'm going to assume that because people assume one thing about you, like you had said earlier. Did I get that right? Okay. So Asia writes, it does not offend me. I just wish others from all backgrounds would be more interested in me as an individual and not as a group, even if I am a part of a group, not knowing which group I belong, because the question is not being asked, lack of wanting to know. Okay. And Erica writes, I agree with Asia. With you, we need to see the person. Okay. All right. So folks, I'm going to go back to my screen, the slide for just a moment. So again, this conversation is much richer than any of what we're going to be talking about on the slides. But again, I'm going to say this, and if you agree that this is kind of the broader takeaway, type a Y in the chat. If you think it's something other than this, type an O in the chat. Okay. So to me, based on this conversation, the takeaway is that it's easy to assume, and we don't want to assume what somebody's cultural identity is, because it may make it harder for them to engage with us. So it's easy to assume, but we don't want to assume someone's cultural identity because it may keep us from being able to engage them. Okay, so I'm getting a lot of Y's in regard, why, you know, why, not W-H-Y, Y's as to that. Okay. And yet, we are in many ways kind of conditioned to assume. So just keeping that in mind as well. And before all the Y's came in, so Dolina says, I am unsure of what you are asking in that question. Actually, Dolina, it really wasn't a question, it was a statement. And I was sort of trying to sum up what are sort of the details of our conversation. There were many unique individual details about people's cultural identities. And the whole point was, I thought, and please unmute and clarify if you think it is something else, but that it's easy to make assumptions about people, and yet we want to avoid making assumptions about a person's cultural identity because it could get in the way of our ability to engage them or communicate with them. Does that make it any clearer? That's more of a statement than a question. So I want to repeat something that Dolina said because I think it's important to this conversation. Dolina says, and I love the way you put it, Dolina. Yeah, your speaker was a little staticky. That's okay. And keep using the chat. Dolina said, I'm nosy. So if I'm not sure, I ask. And I guess I'll underline something there. I want to throw this idea out to you that we're never sure unless the person tells us. So even if we think we're sure, we're not sure unless the person tells us. unless the person tells us. So Alberto writes, it is important to be curious and want to learn more about the other person. Thank you, Alberto. And Asia said the same thing. You'd like people to be curious about who you are. Am I correct on that, Asia? And Asia's going to type in the chat, or she could nod her head yes. Okay, she typed in the chat yes. Okay. All right, good. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And again, thinking about this above the waterline, what we see, and again, even if what we see is what we see, it may not necessarily be who that person culturally identifies as. So we want to be careful about any assumptions that we might make. So cultural identity, the idea of being part of a group or groups, and the ability to associate with a group of people and feel a connection with them based on the culture. Again, people don't belong to just one group necessarily, or are part of just one group. They're in a number of groups. And many of those defining features of those groups become, and somebody mentioned in the chat, how that they've drawn, because they grew up around African culture and Latino culture, their cultural identity is drawn from many of those. So it's a combination. And again, thinking for yourself about your own cultural identity. And I invited you to type something in the chat that was important in regard to your cultural identity. So again, culture, this idea that it can have all these elements to it. And some of you mentioned values when you talked about family. Again, culture is massive and very comprehensive. And if you can, think about these things for yourself. Sort of the knowledge and the stories you care, the language or the languages you speak, sort of traditions and rituals that you may have. So thinking about and again, food and drink, the arts, values, tools and objects, technical skills, greater community. And competence, and Juanita, you really alluded to this before, competence is what we know. And it sometimes includes what we think we know. And what we think we know may not actually be that person's truth. So there are a number of terms that fall under the umbrella of cultural competence. And you can see them all here. And what I'm going to ask you to do is look at all these, and I'll just read them, but look at them and type in the chat the one that's most familiar or that's most meaningful to you. So I'm going to read them out loud, but type in the chat which one of them is most familiar or most meaningful to you. Cultural sensitivity, culturally relevant, cultural responsiveness, linguistically competent, cultural intelligence, culturally appropriate, cultural proficiency, culturally aware, cultural humility, and cultural consciousness. And again, type the one that is most familiar to you or is most important to you. And so far, I think we have a few, perfect. A lot of people have responded already. That's great. So culturally aware, culturally intelligent, cultural intelligence, cultural sensitivity, cultural consciousness, cultural sensitivity, cultural humility, cultural sensitivity, sensitivity, awareness, culturally appropriate. Wonderful. So again, if we can get everybody to kind of weigh in which one of these feels most you're most aware of, familiar with, or that is most important to you. Great. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a moment and ask, let's see, Robert, would it be all right if I asked you a question?
Sure, go ahead.
So Robert, of those terms, was there one that you're more familiar with or one that was more important to you?
More aware of culture, being culturally aware
Okay.
of everyone's different backgrounds and how you're able to go ahead and relate to certain things. I've grown up in a number of different backgrounds, military, religious backgrounds, work backgrounds. And it's always important to be able to understand how people think, what people think, and why they think that way. And sometimes if you miss something, you're not able to go ahead and fully understand who they are, and what they are seeking from you as an individual.
So again, a curiosity and a desire to understand what may be meaningful to that person.
Exactly.
So that ultimately you can be more effective in your work.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Robert. Thanks.
No worries.
Yeah. Yeah. Christina, any thoughts? Christina M, any thoughts about which one stood out to you or which one? Oh, you're going to type the answer. Okay. Christina's going to type the answer. All right. Yes, you can type. Absolutely. And while you're typing, I'm going to go ahead and go to Zakia. So Zakia, any one of those in particular that you're more familiar with or that's more important to you?
I wrote culturally aware only because it's important to be aware of people's culture. I also wanted to lean more to cultural sensitivity because not being just assuming is dangerous, is just as bad as being biased about someone's culture. So being sensitive to that person's what that person identifies also plays a really important role in being cultural competence. Cultural, same thing. Culturally competent.
Okay. Thank you, Zakia. Thank you. So I'm going to just check the chat. And Christina, I think you're still typing, yes? Okay. So Christina's still typing. And while Christina's typing, I'll put it this way. I'm going to show my cards in terms of I'm going to share with you which one I lean more toward. And I'll explain why. But I see that Christina finished typing in the chat, so I want to read. I put cultural aware. I agree with Robert. If I can understand my culture and someone else's culture, I can relate more. Excellent. Thank you, Christina. So, and if this is a surprise to you, which one I tell you that I lean more toward, if this is a surprise to you, type S in the chat. If it's not a surprise, type N. Okay. So here it comes. I lean more to, I'm more familiar with, I know of all of them, but I lean more toward, and I feel more alignment with cultural humility. So if that's a surprise to you, type an S. If that's not a surprise to you, type an N. Okay, so we're getting kind of a mix bag here of no, well, a lot of actually just turned into a lot more that it's not a surprise. Okay, for some people it was. Eric S, you said that it was a surprise. Would you be willing to elaborate on that?
Yes. I'm a little bit ambivalent. In one respect, cultural humility I know is very important, but it's less understood by more people as I see it. But in another hand, I see you as very knowledgeable in the subject and very caring about others. So it kind of makes sense. So I'm a little bit ambivalent about my answer.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks. Rebecca, are you able to unmute? No? Yes? No?
Yes.
Super. Rebecca, what was my leaning toward cultural humility a surprise to you or not a surprise to you?
It wasn't a
Was not.
surprise. No.
Okay. Okay, why were you not surprised?
You don't appear not to be, if you understand what I mean.
I do.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, okay, all right. Thank you. So I'm gonna tell you folks why I lean, for me, more toward cultural humility. And again, wherever you lean is fine, just being aware of it. But the reason I lean toward cultural humility, because it helps me, and I have to work on this all the time, about not making assumptions. Because cultural humility basically lays out that there's only one culture I can ever be an expert in and ever be competent in. And Wendy, whose culture is that? Wendy's about to unmute.
Your own.
Exactly. I can only be an expert in my own culture. So, I'm thinking of the situation with Asia, that if I'm leaning toward cultural humility, I can work to walk into that conversation and say, I don't know about Asia's cultural identity. I want to know about it. I'm curious about it. And like Eric, and like other people, I think Dolina said this, I'm going to ask questions because I want to understand Asia and I want to know where she's coming from. Julianne, any thoughts, any reactions to that?
When I think of cultural humility, I also think of that within that there's having an awareness of your own bias.
Yes, 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 and absolutely, and being aware that you're not aware of your biases because they're your biases. Yeah, and Julianne, you made me think of one other thing that's, I think, a unique facet to cultural humility, which is also the acknowledgement of the power imbalance. That cultural humility is really about, like, I want to make sure if Julianne and I are working together, that Julianne is an equal partner in determining her care and sharing with me her needs. So I'm trying to let go of the power that I may have being in the role that I'm in. Thanks so much, Julianne. Thank you. Thanks. So again, more things coming in the chat, which is fantastic. Let me just take a moment. Alberto writes, I think you can become more competent if you move to another country or even another state with slightly different culture. Okay, because again, and Alberto, maybe you can put this in the chat, why you think that effect may happen. I have my own thoughts about it, but I'd be very curious to know what your reaction is. Asia put, I put no, that it wasn't a surprise. If I would have said S, I would have been making an assumption that I do not know enough about you. Okay. Erica, Asia writes, no, it is not. No is giving the person in question the opportunity to share why he believes in whatever he believes in. Yes. Peter, thank you, Peter. Accepting each other's differences regardless of our viewpoint and disagreement is important. Alberto adds, if you're able to surround yourself with another culture, you can understand it better. And Alberto, I'm going to use a word and tell me if this word sort of connects to what you're saying, is the idea of immersion, because you're immersed and you're connecting with the people of that culture. You are going to be able to understand it better than if you're, looking at it from a greater distance. So the immersion, yeah, okay, yes, exactly. Okay, thanks, Alberto. All right, folks, let's go back to the slides for just a moment. So we can also think of cultural competence on a continuum. And if I'm going to ask you to use your astute powers of observation as you look at this continuum, but as you notice at the top where it says cultural proficiency, and you'll notice where it says growth, where the H is really high, what do you see there at the quote unquote end of the line? So if somebody wants to unmute or type it in the chat, what's at the end of the continuum line? And a couple of people have put it in the chat. Yes, it's an up arrow. It keeps going. Yes, absolutely. Yes, and you're right, Natasha, cultural proficiency is there. So folks, this is a constantly moving process. And I like to think of it this way. We are always moving toward cultural proficiency if we're doing the work. And keep in mind, folks, you're doing the work right now because you're part of this learning community conversation. The sheer fact that we as a group are talking with each other about our own cultures and talking about cultural competence is part of the work. So that work is ongoing, and you sort of will never reach quote unquote cultural competence or cultural proficiency because no two people are ever the same. So that's why there's an arrow at the end. But again, let's look at this continuum. The idea of cultural destructiveness, cultural incapacity, the inability to work across cross-cultural situations, cultural blindness, and oftentimes the way that's expressed is I don't see color. Cultural pre-contemplation, cultural competence, and cultural proficiency. And again, I really appreciate that this slide has the word growth on it, because we can choose to grow toward cultural competence and cultural proficiency. I'm curious, and I'm going to stop sharing. Well, let me advance the slide one, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen to ask you this. And whoever wants to unmute, and maybe Zakia, if it's okay, could I ask you to respond to this?
Yeah, sure.
Why do you think somebody might say, I don't see color? Go ahead, Zakia, say what you want to say.
No, I personally think that they have, let me think about it.
Okay. She's unmuting to think about it. Okay, go ahead.
When somebody say, I don't see color, it basically means that I personally believe that they don't want to address the hard questions or feelings. It's something that they don't want to discuss because of their own biases or because of their own preconceived notion about a specific culture or about a specific culture. So instead of discussing what they think about it, they just leave it to the wayside. It just doesn't want to address it.
So they're kind of just pushing it to the side because I don't want to deal with that.
Yeah, basically.
Okay. Asia wrote too, or they don't want to be offensive.
I personally believe by saying that you're offensive because you don't want to accept that I am different or I may identify as something totally different from you.
Yes.
So by saying that, you're being very offensive.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for sharing your perspective on that, Zakia. Tatiana, I see your hand is up. Go ahead. We can't hear you, Tatiana. I see that you're unmuted and I see that your hand is up, but we're not hearing anything.
Can you hear me? No?
We can now. Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry. It's a little slow over here.
It's all right.
I was raised and like I put there, very, I guess, multicultural background, different ethnicities. And my parents in the house, the friends were always, when I mean different races, different everything, straight, gay, very like that. So I was raised with that mindset. You don't see color because what you're seeing is an individual, not what they are on outside. Until I started getting older and realized people don't like that. People don't like hearing you say that you don't see color because people do. And I had to learn, right, how to, and this I learned in grad school, all the way in grad school it took me to learn that people are sensitive about that. And there's different ways of saying you see people as people and equal instead of saying, I don't see color.
Yes. Yep. Thank you, Tatiana. So, Roshana, can I ask you a question? All right. So, Roshana, if you and I were working together, and let's say you were a patient receiving services or client receiving services, and I was the person who had the opportunity to work with you, and we're meeting for the first time, and I say to you, and let me just preface here, I would not say this, but just for the purposes of demonstration, I'm gonna sort of cast myself in this role. And if I'd said to you, Roshana, you know, I just want you to know, as we're working together, I don't see color. If I said that to you, how would it make you feel? And what do you think you might do? Or how do you think you might react?
Like I wrote in the chat, I said that sometimes people don't want to address the topic of color and how people associate it with race. Yeah. So I would believe that maybe, I don't want to say that you want to have an out on the conversation. Maybe you just don't want to address the fact that you are linking me, my color of being of a browner skin, you're linking me to being of the African-American race or culture. So, I mean, I don't know if I will be mad though, because I'm just so used to people having a preconceived notion of what race or background they think people come from. So I don't think I will be upset. I just think that you are kind of closed-minded in a sense, because just because I'm of a different color of you, or I could be Caucasian, you never know. I could be Hispanic, you never know. So I would just think that you don't want to address the topic that you may have a color and a race problem.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. And very similar to what Zakia said, the idea of kind of pushing the thing to the side. Yeah. Okay. So go ahead, Eric, please go right ahead. Yeah, I see your hands up.
If you're from the dominant culture, you're probably more apt to say this because you don't want to be accused of being racist. I can say that I rarely hear people from minority cultures make that same statement because they're well aware that the disparities still exist.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for adding that, Eric. And again, you know, Mozella says yes with an exclamation point, Eric. So I think that, you know, there are a couple of things that Eric said, and I want to underline them. One of them is, Eric, you said the people from the dominant culture. And in this country, quote unquote, who is the dominant culture? Yes, Mozella types in white. Yes, or people assumed to be white. And what makes them, quote unquote, dominant? I'll give you a clue. It begins with the word, go ahead, Zakia.
I think status, like money.
Yeah. Yeah, that's part of it. And ultimately, you could sort of roll it up into one big ball of power and access to power, which can be money and resources and intergenerational wealth and history and property. And much of this country and much of the systems in this country have been framed around the concepts and around the precepts of structural racism as a way to particularly deny specific groups of people, deny opportunity, deny access to resources, deny access to housing, which is a way to cause people to have less power. So just keeping that in mind, let's move forward. And you know, it's funny because it made me think of this last point. I'm going to go back a slide. It made me think of well, actually, it's the first piece of this continuum about cultural destructiveness, because there's another chapter in the history of this country where there was an intentional series of actions and laws that were geared toward destroying the cultures of the indigenous people that inhabited this country before white Europeans took over the land of this country. And there were efforts that were specifically made to destroy these particular cultures. And that can often be referred to as intentional cultural genocide. And I'm very curious, and if you're familiar with this, folks, type a Y in the chat, and because it was in the news recently. If you're familiar with this, type in the chat the Indian schools that were run in this country. Okay, so Eric is familiar with it. Wendy is familiar with it. Dolene is familiar with it. Juanita, yes. Asia, Julianne, yes. Okay, so people are familiar with that. And Julianne, if you don't mind, could I ask you to unmute and just say a little bit about what you know about the Indian schools?
Yeah, so what I know is that when, and I don't know the date, like the dates, you know, the years that this happened, but as part of, you know, the cultural genocide that our country was a part of, that a lot of Native American kids ended up going to these like boarding schools that were run by white Christian sort of missionaries. And a lot of the kids died at those schools because of abusive practices. And the numbers were covered up for a really long time. And so people are now kind of rediscovering, or at least is getting more media coverage, just how many kids died this way.
Yeah, and I want to share two very specific details. Okay, thank Julianne, thank you. That was really right on the money. Thank you. Did not know about this. Okay, so two details that I want to share. One is that sort of the motto that many of these schools were run by, and this is a quote: the purpose of the schools was to kill the Indian to save the man. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And as Julianne said, these children many of them were abducted. They were taken from their parents and forced to live in these schools. Their hair would be cut in a European way. So boys that had, you know, braids or whatever, they were cut off immediately. They were not allowed to eat their own native foods, and they were punished severely if they spoke their native language. And those are just three details. But again, an intentional desire to destroy a culture. Okay, just keeping that in mind, folks. So there are benefits to clients if we choose to move toward cultural competence. Again, access to services, because people will feel more engaged. People may feel safe, and I'm going to add another word to this, and hopefully you'll be okay with it, but I would also say that they may have a greater sense of being accepted and welcomed. Two words: accepted and welcome, in addition to safe. And being able to understand how the person's cultural background and the traumas that they may have experienced connected to that background are currently affecting that individual's health potentially. But again, being open to the idea that a person's cultural history can have an impact on that person either receiving care or not receiving care in the present. Clearly, language accessibility. If you don't have anybody who can speak the language of this person, it's going to make it difficult for that person to feel safe, welcome, and accepted. Moving toward being open to, being curious about cultural competence can really help to let that person know that you're respecting their basic human rights, that you're seeking to understand their values, and that can be incorporated into whatever treatment plans are developed for them. Now, those are some of the benefits to the clients or the populations that are served. Here's a list of many of the benefits that actually can impact the organization by choosing to move toward cultural competence. And you can see this list here, and I'm going to just focus on the fourth bullet down, which is improved access, which I think really connects to what we just said about the benefit to patients or clients. But more people will have the opportunity to actually access services and care. And a couple of bullets down further, you'll also see tailored service delivery. Some folks mentioned that earlier, that if you can have an understanding of somebody's culture, the way the services are provided, the way the service is actually composed can actually have an impact on that service being more effective. And ultimately, the last bullet, the idea of collaborative partnerships. So think about for yourselves as you look at this list and you look at these benefits that can benefit the organization, which one of these might be most important to you as a staff person working at a particular organization? And just kind of, look at the list and identify that for yourself. Which one of these might be most important to you working, maybe where you work currently, or if you're not working, if you were working somewhere, which one of these might be most important to you as somebody who's a member of that organization? So just sort of think about that just for a moment for yourself. All right. So I think the thing to also keep in mind, folks, is cultural competence, moving toward cultural proficiency, is not a one and done. It's a much larger systems change. It's not just, okay, everybody, this is our annual cultural competence training. Show up to that training, get your certificate, and then you'll be culturally competent. And again, I told you at the very beginning that that will not be the outcome of this particular conversation. My hope, though, is one of the outcomes of this particular conversation in part 2 is that we as a learning community will be moving toward cultural competence and cultural proficiency because we're engaging in a conversation about culture and the impact of culture. So, social determinants of health. And before I go into this, I just want to ask, if you're familiar with social determinants of health, type a Y in the chat. If you're not familiar with them, type an N. Okay, Wendy is familiar, perfect. Some people are, some people aren't. Okay. Okay, okay. Some people are, some people aren't. Okay. So I'm going to make 2 statements and then I'll share the slides. This class not only helps in our work, but also in our everyday lives. Yes, that's possible, Dolina, absolutely. Because again, cultural competence, we can choose to use that in our interpersonal relationships when we're not at work. Absolutely. Being curious, being respectful, wanting to know about somebody more deeply. So I'm going to make two statements about social determinants of health. One is that your zip code can actually have where you live, your zip code can actually have an impact on how long you live. Okay, Julianne's nodding her head. I think she agrees with that. Okay, yeah, and people are typing a Y in the chat. They agree with that. Okay, so that's one thing. And that's kind of a large way of thinking of social determinants of health. I will throw out one other thing that I'd like you to consider, is that only 10% in terms of the impact of healthcare, only 10% of that really impacts someone's health or longevity. There are other factors that have much more influence than the health care that the person receives. Okay, so social determinants of health encourages us, wants us to think about health and wellness as impacted by a lot more than just seeking medical care. Because what does the zip code you live in actually have to do with whether you get medical care or not? Unless you're next to a hospital. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and share these slides. So I think it's important to keep in mind when we're talking about social determinants of health is the idea of health disparities, meaning that if you belong to a particular group, if you live in a particular environment, if you have particular experiences, you're going to have health disparities, meaning somebody that's not from the same group, not in the same situation, is not going to have the health problem that some people may have. So just keep in mind that all of these elements impact someone's health outcomes. Okay, and I'm curious to ask, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a moment because I want to ask this. Does anybody have any thoughts about, and if you could unmute to respond to this, it would be helpful. Does anybody have any thoughts about why, when the COVID pandemic started, why Black and brown people were in the higher number ranges of people getting infected with COVID-19? Any thoughts about that? And if you could unmute, yeah, go ahead, Zakia. And then Eric wants to say something too. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just assuming. I think it has a lot to do with diet and access to healthier food choices or options. Lack of money to buy food, healthier food, and just lifestyle.
Okay.
We eat more fatty foods. We tend to eat a lot more fatty fried foods, you know. So I think that has a lot to do with our weaker immune system, so to speak.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Zakia. Go ahead, Eric. And then I see Juanita, you're unmuted too. You want to say something as well. Go ahead, Eric.
I think it had a lot to do with a lack of or lesser access to healthcare than other populations.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Eric. Juanita.
So I would echo that. Resources, lack of resources. I know that in some communities, let's say, and I'll just say how Bedford-Stuyvesant or East New York or Brownsville.
Yeah.
If you go into those neighborhoods, you'll see more liquor stores. You'll see things that are, to me, detrimental to people's health in those communities. But if I go to like Sheepshead Bay, I'll see more fruit stands, more doctor offices, which of course impacts the health in those various communities differently.
Yep. Thank you, Juanita. Mozella, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead. And a number of people have typed some things in the chat. So I want to acknowledge those two. Go ahead, Mozella.
People are forgetting about the history. Remember
Say a little more about that, please.
It was something about syphilis. I know it was something that these people were tested and they I don't know, they were guinea pigs, to put it mildly. But there's a lot of mistrust. And I know I had a very hard time getting my mom to get the vaccine because of the mistrust.
Yeah, thank you, Mozella. And I really thank you so much for bringing that onto the table. And a number of people, Michael says he agrees with that. And a number of people put in the chat the Tuskegee Experiment. And again, it's a perfect example of cultural history impacting the health of people living today. And Mozella, I thought, said it beautifully when she said that experiment created great distrust, and understandably so. So just to be clear about what the Tuskegee Experiment was, Black men were intentionally not treated for syphilis so that the medical community could actually watch the progression of the disease. There was treatment available, but they were not given the treatment. Yeah, they were thank you, Asia. They were given a placebo, which is a fake drug. Okay. And again, they did it because they wanted to watch the progression of the disease at the expense of the men. That it's absolutely, Mozella, horrible, exclamation point, unethical. And when it came to light, it actually had a very powerful impact on how medicine sort of and clinical trials were going to be conducted going forward. And again, Mozella, you gave such a personal example, the difficulty of your mother wanting to get vaccinated for COVID-19, because why should she trust the medical community when the past has shown that the medical community wants to abuse us? Yeah, go ahead, Roshana.
I think that we can kind of like tie this into cultural background, because for me personally, through the whole COVID pandemic, my family comes from West Indian Caribbean background, and we don't really subscribe to Western medicine. We never did. So for us, it's more of like my grandmother has teas and herbs for every single thing that you could think of. So with me, I personally had COVID, and I had COVID for like 3 days. Really no symptoms. Only thing I couldn't do was taste or smell. But I feel like for me, when I started noticing signs of that, I drink herbs on a regular basis, but I really started to load up on my herbs when I noticed that I had COVID. And I felt like it helped me a lot. I don't know for other people. I don't want to say that that's what you should do or what they should have done. But I just feel like when you come from a culture or a background that doesn't really subscribe to Western medicine, it's not about the mistrust. It's about, this is not something I'm used to doing.
Right. It's not part of my world. We have a different perspective on this. Yeah. And you know something? The thing that I love about the fact that we're talking about cultural competence and sort of cultural proficiency is that cultural competence and cultural proficiency would allow the ability to have a conversation with Roshana about the vaccine, because the person could respect that is her cultural experience and ask permission to share information about the vaccine, and then respect that Roshana would make her own choice about whether she would get vaccinated or not. And cultural competence could make that kind of conversation possible. The information could be shared in an appropriate, respectful way, and the person can still tell us about their cultural experience, and they can make their decision. And let's face it, if I was the worker and Roshana was my client and I really cared about her, I might not like her decision, but I would want to respect it because she ultimately will decide what her care will be. Yeah, yeah. Asia just typed something about that people, yes, thank you, Asia. A lot of people were forced to choose between their beliefs and their livelihoods. Yes, because certain systems said, if you want to continue to do this work, you must be vaccinated. And that put people in a situation where their culture perhaps wasn't respected or even considered. And, you know, it's a very complex issue when we're talking about public health. So again, I do really believe that cultural competence and cultural proficiency, sort of conversations informed by that, people who are curious about understanding would probably have better outcomes. Okay, and I wanted to just read something that Alberto wrote too. Alberto wrote in the chat, essential workers that could not work from home were mostly minorities. Yes, that is also one of the factors. And again, we've looked at several elements that contributed to the pandemic, kind of shining a spotlight on health disparities. So just briefly back to the social determinants of health. You can think about it from these particular factors and their interrelationship. The individual factors, the factors that are not behavioral, but are behavioral. So not behavioral would be the person's race, their age, their gender, their culture, and their belief that they can accomplish something, their self-efficacy. Individual behaviors, and some folks, Zakia, you mentioned this in terms of diet, but the idea of exercise, diet, coping, and addiction. And then, as others have mentioned in terms of access to care, we have to think about the public services and infrastructure. And as some people said, someone mentioned in the chat, living in a crowded environment. Again, living in working conditions. Remember I said at the beginning, your zip code can have a significant impact on your lifespan. And when I look at this living and working conditions, I always think of the water problems. And I believe it was Flint, Michigan, where the water was contaminated and folks were living in a toxic environment. And many of them, for a variety of reasons, couldn't leave. Yes. Dolina says, yes, it was Flint, Michigan. Yes. And then the last one to consider too, because they're all related. And again, we're talking about larger systems, larger factors, the social, economic, and political factors. Because again, we live in a society that has these elements: discrimination, communication, political participation, social cohesion, racism, segregation, stigma, inequality, multiple life events, and poverty. All of these elements impact people's health and lives. This is kind of another way to look at it. And again, you'll notice that 10% at the bottom, that is where, that is the impact that healthcare plays in terms of these social determinants. And if you add up 20, 30, and 40, those other pieces, which again, helping to understand somebody's culture, genomics, you can't really, it's important to know that because people, based on their genes, may be more susceptible to particular illnesses. But this idea of that the socioeconomic and environmental factors and consumer behaviors, those are things that when we provide services, those are things we can actually, have as part of the conversation. Yes, Eric writes in that vaccination became a political issue for some. That's absolutely true. Yeah, so public health and medicine were also politicized. So the goal here, folks, is we really want to move toward health equity. And, you know, the word that I really want to stress here is that everyone, and I'll say it again, everyone has the opportunity to fair and just health and the possibility of that health. Erica writes, oh, okay, not a problem, Erica. Thanks for letting me know. Erica has to log off. Hopefully she'll be able to log back on. If not, we'll see her the next time. So again, keep in mind, folks, that cultural competence, cultural proficiency, factoring in the influences of culture and those influences on individual behaviors, as you saw from the earlier slide, how important individual behaviors are, all can lead toward the goal of health equity, so that we're moving toward trying to make sure that everybody has a fair and just opportunity to health. So, keeping in mind this idea that, you know, health and wellness, every cultural group has their understanding of it. And we had that wonderful example in terms of, you know, different cultures use different things to treat illnesses that they may have. If we can expand our understanding, it can really help toward health and wellness. This idea that the social determinants of health, we want to keep in mind the community, what's going on in the community, the individual, and how they would determine their healthy future. And this idea that health is not necessarily solely determined by medical care or the doctor or the nurse or whomever, but mostly by living conditions, back to your zip code, where you live. The idea of thinking about well-being as opposed to health. And well-being, to me, opens up larger possibilities for those other factors. And identify and approach health equity as the goal. That is the reason we are focusing on this conversation and what we see, hopefully, as the outcome that we want to achieve for everybody. Health equity, that fair and just opportunity to achieve health. So, person-centeredness. When you think of person-centeredness, what's the first thing that comes into your mind? What do you think? And I think some people are typing. Let's see. Motivational interviewing. Okay. I did not pay Eric to say that, but he did say it. He did type it. Okay. Anything else come into your mind when you think of person-centeredness? In some ways, I think it goes, yes, self-centered, that it's the center is that person. Eddie mentions empathy in terms of that we want to be interacting with the person in an empathetic way. Absolutely. So the thing that I like most about mentioning this idea of person-centeredness and cultural competence, because it seems like they're a perfect match. Of course, we are going to be striving toward person-centeredness if we're also working toward cultural competence and cultural proficiency. So we really want to make sure that the person's needs, wants, their desires, and their goals are being considered. And again, our attempt to understand those through their unique experience. And again, I would go back to that wonderful example of difficulty getting one's mother to get vaccinated because of their particular experience. Again, allowing for that person to verbalize that and let that be part of the conversation. And that the person is the center of the care delivery. They're part of that, the individual. And that's where I really appreciate this word of centering. Their needs as they define them, not necessarily as how I may define them. And the ones that they identify as priorities. So we'll just briefly touch on implicit bias. But before we do that, I see that somebody put something in the chat. Let me just check it. That the person is placed in front of anything that they are dealing with. Example, person with mental health. Yes, understood. Yep, that they are put at the center before sort of what my agenda might be. Yes. Yep, okay, thank you, Asia. So implicit bias. I think the thing that I'd like you to take away in regard to this is it's also known as unconscious bias. And when we were talking in the very beginning, people kept talking about, you know, people may have biases in one way or another. And those biases may be conscious biases, but we're talking about implicit or unconscious bias. And I think the thing to keep in mind here is that if you're a human being living within our culture today, you have unconscious bias. You have implicit bias. And I'm going to focus on a particular word. Yes, and Asia writes in, I have that, we all do. Yes, thank you, Asia. We all do, but I'm going to underline a particular word, unconscious, which means that you're not necessarily aware of it. And it's still impacting how you interact, how you relate with people around you. And it is often comes out when you are particularly under stress. That's oftentimes when unconscious bias, any kind of stress, comes out other times too, but stress can really, or having to make an instantaneous decision can really allow an unconscious bias to present itself. And again, the idea that it allows the person to make a snapshot judgment of the people or the surroundings that they're particularly in. So I'm curious, and I'm just going to invite somebody to comment on this. Maybe Wendy, would it be okay if I asked you this question?
Sure, go ahead.
So if we're in agreement, and again, I don't want to make any assumptions, but if we're kind of entertaining the idea that everybody has unconscious bias or implicit bias, and it's unconscious, what can we do about that? And why is it important to know that it's there?
I think knowing it's there and recognizing it is the first step, because there's absolutely nothing you can do if you pretend it doesn't.
Okay.
So I
So
think
the
that's the
acknowledgement
first step.
that it's there.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And what can we do about it? We just have to continue. This is probably the 952nd cultural competency training that I've been through over the last 20 years. We just have to keep trying to get better, be more aware, and just continue to try to get better.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thanks. So Peter, could I ask you a question?
Sure.
So, you know, we heard Wendy's thought about why it's important to be aware of unconscious or implicit bias. And again, Wendy, I want to make sure I'm quoting you correctly. You were saying that the first place to start is that we all have it, and acknowledging that it's
Believe
there.
that to be true, yes.
Okay. Okay. So Peter, my question to you is if we all have it, and we're having this conversation about cultural competence and cultural proficiency, why is it important for us to acknowledge that we have it?
Well, I mean, acknowledging is, I think it's important because when you acknowledge, you recognize, that there's something that needs, for us to be aware of or for us to get more information about. And this is what these trainings are for, to bring to awareness our unconscious behavior and our unconscious thoughts to be, to become our awareness. So continuing education, it's so acknowledging, again, coming back to acknowledgement is important. It's like change. If you don't recognize the need for a change, change is not going to happen.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And a couple of people have written some things in the chat. Alberto wrote, try to recognize when our implicit biases are affecting our judgments. Okay, because keep in mind, we're in a position, if we're providing services, we're making judgments all the time. And Asia writes in, to correct any behaviors that can determine an outcome unsuitable for the person receiving services. And Tejan writes, institutions and individuals can identify areas, and I really appreciate you also opening it up to institutions, can identify areas where our implicit biases may affect our behaviors and judgments. Again, our behaviors and our judgments, how we interact with somebody. Instituting specific procedures of decision-making and encouraging people to be mindful of the risks of implicit bias can help us avoid acting according to the biases that are contrary to our conscious values and beliefs. Thank you so much for adding that, Tejan, because, and hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Okay, Pamela writes, if you are aware, you're open to change. Yes. So the first step in that, and again, I'm going to underline what people wrote in the chat and also what Wendy and Robert said, or I'm sorry, was it Robert? No, it was Peter. What Peter said, thanks, Peter, is what Peter said is the idea it's starting with the acknowledgement that it's there, that we have it. It doesn't make you a bad person, and you can acknowledge that it's there and work toward fairness and being curious about how you're making the decisions that you're making. So just keeping that in mind, let's go back to the slides for just a moment. Before I do that though, Juanita, what's your thought? What's your reaction to the implicit, what we're talking about, implicit bias or unconscious bias? What's your thought or reaction to that?
I think one, that is definitely true that we all have it. We all carry it with us. Mm-hmm. I echo the sentiment that, you have to recognize it within yourself to be able to correct it. Mm-hmm. And I also think that, sometimes putting yourself in uncomfortable environments where you're forced to learn and grow and know mm-hmm. about another culture that, you normally wouldn't be interacting with, mm-hmm. is a way to combat that.
Yeah. So that being open to being exposed to other cultures, mm-hmm. learning about other cultures. Okay.
Yeah.
Julianne, did you want to say something?
I really like, Juanita, what you just said about that we have to put ourselves sometimes in positions that are uncomfortable because that's where growth happens.
Yes. Yep. Thank you. I think you were going to type that in the chat, but then I kind of got a sense that you were. Okay. So I want to underline one other thing that that was written in the chat, and sometimes this is hard to kind of wrap your head around, but this is the power of implicit or unconscious bias. Okay. And remember, it's unconscious. We can work toward making it conscious, but it's unconscious. But I really love the way that this was articulated in the chat. Tejan wrote this, that implicit bias we can act in ways that are biased, that are contrary to our conscious values and beliefs. So we can consciously believe, hold particular values, and our unconscious biases can actually cause us to interact in ways that are not in line with those values. And it can create what's called dissonance, where we have this uncomfortable feeling, this tension, because we believe something, but we just did something that doesn't sort of link to that belief. And what I'd like to throw out for you to consider is that be aware of that uncomfortable feeling, that dissonance, and be curious about it, because it can potentially open up a door for you. Has anyone ever taken the Harvard implicit bias tests? Yeah, okay, so a couple of people have taken them. If you've never taken them, you can Google that, the Harvard implicit bias tests. And again, this is a test that can help you to identify your biases. But if you've never taken it, if nothing else, it's just interesting to look at. There are a whole bunch of different tests. And again, it's called the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. And it can be a tool that can help raise your awareness. So what I'm going to ask everybody to do at this particular moment is take a nice deep breath and let it go. Good. So we are at the conclusion of part one of our conversation. And what I'd like to ask everybody to do is just take a moment and reflect on your experience of this conversation. What you heard, what you said, what you read. So just focus on that for a minute. And focusing on that, let one thing rise to the top. Just one thing that, hello, Jasmine, nice to see your camera. One thing that stands out to you from our conversation today. And just type that in the chat. One thing that stands out to you from our conversation today. There's no right or wrong here because it's the thing that stands out to you. If it only makes sense to you, that's fine too. Just the one thing that stands out to you. And just go ahead and type that in the chat. Yeah, Eric writes that everyone is biased. Hemwati writes awareness. Peter, the importance of awareness and doing something about it. Randolph, that we make unconscious snapshot judgments. Yep. Alberto, repetition. Cultural competences, cultural humility. Our conversation about health disparities. Thanks, Natasha. Inclusion. Dolina, understanding. Wendy, that there is always something to be learned regarding this topic, okay? Because you have been to millions of these trainings, Wendy, as you said. Uncomfortable, yeah. Bias, cultural identity is different for everyone. Similar experiences, comprehension of differences. It's okay to be curious or nosy within my profession. How important this topic is, the idea that implicit bias really comes out in stress or quick decisions, yeah. Inclusion and belonging, being aware and open to receive makes differences in the care we give. Awareness, implicit bias, that we can never really stop learning. It's a virtue. Yeah, thank you, Randolph. Everyone has implicit bias. Oh, and also not assuming someone's race. The importance of asking questions to better understand, awareness, and we shouldn't assume. Okay. And there may be other things too. Folks, I can't thank you enough for your participation today. I look forward to seeing you next time for part 2 of our conversation. So have a good week or good day in between when we see each other next. See you soon. Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody.